What's up, everybody? Pastor Matt here. Hope all is well for you and yours. I'm going through kind of an identity crisis myself, to be completely honest. Did my 23andMe genetic background research recently, thanks to my wife who got that for me as a gift. It was something I was wanting for a long time. Found out I'm far less Irish than I thought I was, which is greatly disturbing to me. Mostly German. I knew that, but I didn't realize just quite how much German I actually am. 87% German. Thought I was 40% Irish, so a little bit disappointed about that. Actually, genealogy is a pretty interesting subject. My dad has done a ton of work in our Everhard family genealogy. And not only that, but we have an Everhard family book, which actually details our history from coming to America from Germany. 1727, we came here. One of the Everhard pastors in 1870 wrote the Everhard book, gave us our whole history. So anyway, I knew I was German, but we thought that we had a little bit more Scots-Irish in us. So I'm a little bit disappointed this morning. Hope that doesn't come across in the video. Anyways, welcome to my channel. Pastor Matt here. I am the pastor of Gospel Fellowship PCA. We are a Reformed Presbyterian Bible-believing church just north of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Love to have you come visit with us at some point in real life. If you're looking for a church or know someone who is, please send them our way. Gospel Fellowship PCA just north of Pittsburgh. All right, so we're going to do a viewer question today, and it's kind of a good one. Every once in a while, I like to do some viewer questions, and typically I select viewer questions that are representative of the kinds of communications that I get. I do get lots of viewer mail. Unfortunately, I can't answer all of it as directly as I wish I could. But I try my best, try to write everybody back at least a couple lines or so. But this one was a fairly typical question, and it's actually kind of a loaded question. It's really two questions in one, and one of them is theological, the other one is a practical matter. And so anyway, let me read the question for you. I'm going to change the name of the person who sent me this question, although I'm going to read most of it fairly faithfully to the text that was sent to me. Change the name just to protect the innocent or the guilty or whatever, but this question has to do with the differences between 1689 Baptist faith and the Westminster Confession of Faith. So here's a question from Daniel. Now that's not his real name. He says, I grew up in independent fundamentalist Baptist churches and attended a dispensationalist fundamental Baptist college. Last spring, after taking a Revelation class, I changed my views on eschatology from dispensational premillennialism to amillennialism. Well, Daniel, I can congratulate you on that change. That, in my view, is an upgrade in terms of your eschatology. Glad to hear that you did that. He goes on, this shift in theology led me to question what else I might not believe anymore. And by July 2020, I was a Calvinist. If you're interested in Calvinism, I've done several videos on this topic, especially under my playlist, The Reformed View. So head over there and you can find some good stuff on what Calvinism is. Quoting, through listening to Vadi Bakum, I discovered the Confessions of Faith and I adopted the 1689 London Baptist Confession of Faith. I became more rooted in my theology through listening to James White and Jeff Durbin. I've actually been listening to a little bit of Durbin and White myself, although I'm not ready to throw myself into the theonomy camp as Durbin is. I definitely appreciate some of his expositional preaching. James White, The Dividing Line, Alpha Omega Ministries, all been helpful stuff to me. Don't agree with all of them, all that they say. Obviously, I'm a Presbyterian confessing the Westminster myself, but I found their stuff to be relatively helpful. He goes on, I love to study theology and I'm constantly checking on new areas where I might need adjusting. Now here comes the question, all right? So here's the practical matter. You're going to sense a theological question and a practical matter kind of spliced together in this question. He says, now that I'm moving back to my hometown, ready to get married to my fiancée, we're looking for a Reformed Baptist church. Unfortunately, the nearest Reformed Baptist church that proclaims the London Baptist Confession 1689 is an hour away. And I don't know if I'm going to get the fellowship and the discipleship that I need from a church that's that far. That's a great question and one that is a real practical issue for a lot of people. There are sadly fewer and fewer faithful, Bible-believing, confessional, traditional, conservative churches, and sometimes you might have to drive some way to get to one. He says, there is, however, a PCA church, PCA, within 10 minutes of our house, and we're considering looking into that. You are the only Presbyterian I know, he says, so I thought I would ask you a couple questions about it. Well, I'm sorry to hear that I'm the only Presbyterian you know, although hopefully you at least came to a trustworthy and friendly source to get some information. So here are his two questions as he frames them, and I'm going to take it the direction that I want to take the answer. He says, do you think that the differences between Baptists and Presbyterians would cause too much discord to be members of the same church? And the second question then has to do with written resources. He's looking for some stuff on Presbyterianism so he can understand what he's going to get into. Especially he mentions covenant theology and infant baptism. Well, Daniel, you probably already know that I have videos on both of those topics. I have quite an extended video on covenant theology, which hopefully takes you through the basics of that. And I also have a number of videos on baptism. There's one in the Reformed View series, but I also have a 4-part video that I did several years ago. There's its own playlist for that on my channel. So assuming that you already knew all of that, since you, Daniel, are a regular viewer of this channel, I suppose that I should get to the question. Now, one thing that we could do is we could do an extended comparison and contrast between the 1689 and the Westminster Confession of Faith. By the way, one thing that I'm jealous of the 1689 Baptists is they have the number 1689. And you see it on posts, and you see it on memes, and you see cool preachers with 1689 tattoos on their forearms. Lots of Baptists love that number. It's kind of a rallying cry, and if you post or meme 1689, people know exactly what you're talking about. We've got a problem in the Westminsterian tradition, and that is we can't decide whether our date should be 1646 or 1647. So you've got us beat on the marketing as far as that number goes. The Westminster Confession of Faith, the main body of the confession, was completed in 1646. So if you want to go with that number, that date, then that's totally appropriate. I see a lot of people write about 1646. But 1647 is when the catechisms were completed and the proof text added to the Westminster Confession of Faith. So you could argue that 1647 is the date that you should get tattooed on your forearm, but that notwithstanding, and I'm obviously not really recommending tattoos here, I can't do a full comparison between these two great documents on one video. For one, I don't know enough about 1689, to be completely honest. You probably already know as much as I do, Daniel, that the 1689 London Baptist Confession was virtually a photocopy of the Westminster Confession with significant modifications, of course, to the section on the sacraments, especially baptism, and, if I'm not mistaken, quite a bit of language related to our ecclesiology. Since the Baptist churches tend to be congregational in form, obviously you're going to see differences on the presbyterial language related to presbyteries and synods, etc. So, I mean, that's pretty superficially obvious that the 1689 is going to have a Baptistic view of the sacraments, and the Westminster Confession is going to have more of a traditional, Reformed, magisterial, Protestant view of the sacraments, especially as preached by Calvin and others. But I want to answer this question slightly differently than just putting these two documents up next to each other and showing you the differences, because I think there's probably some websites where you can find that information much more easily than I could say it. And if you're really concerned about the differences between Presbyterian and 1689 confessional theology, that's probably your best bet, is to simply line up those two documents and point out the differences. I, however, want to talk a little bit more about the practical matter of choosing a church. And for me, this answer really resolves in what I would call your marginal tolerances for theological difference in a congregation. And all of us are going to have a little bit of different marginal tolerances. Now, when I say a marginal tolerance, it's kind of a phrase borrowed from mechanical engineering, where you design a certain machine, but it's actually able to tolerate a little bit more weight and wear and tear than it says it's able to. So for instance, an elevator might say 2,000 pounds, but really it can actually hold 5,000 pounds. They're just not going to say that on the label. And so there's these tolerances, and we have those as it goes with our theology. There are certain things that we're able to tolerate, and there's other things that we can't tolerate. And how much theological difference we're able to assume in the church that we belong in That's kind of a little bit of how you're wired as a person and how strict you're going to be with the people that are doing the preaching and the teaching. Um, Let me say it this way. If it's going to absolutely drive you nuts, Daniel, every single time you see an infant baptism take place in a Presbyterian church, and you're going to find yourself gritting your teeth and the gnashing, the agony, the angst inside of you building every time you see that, then it's going to probably be difficult for you to get along there peacefully. Now, um, we're all able to flex and give a little bit when it comes to the congregation that we're part of, because if we're completely honest, almost every single church that you possibly could join as a member is going to have some variance between you and what's taught if you're sitting in the pews. Now, that could be that you believe every single thing that your pastor says. Maybe you never check him according to his sources. Maybe you don't check the cross references. Maybe you just totally agree with everything your pastor says. That's possible. Perhaps not ideal. I do think we should be listening with not a critical ear, but a discerning ear to what we hear in the pews. But even amongst Presbyterians, even within the PCA, even within our presbytery, Ascension Presbytery here in the PCA, Western Pennsylvania, and perhaps even within churches, for the churches that have 2 or more pastors, you're going to have some marginal tolerance, some degrees of differences between what we think on certain matters. The more refined you make your theology, the more nuance you're going to discover in the things that you're hearing. And so, Daniel, I would say to you, you have to know yourself a little bit. If you're going to find yourself constantly kicking against the goads or kicking against the pricks, as it says in the old scriptures, you may find yourself very uncomfortable in a Presbyterian church. You are going to see infant baptisms, and you are going to hear confessional, covenantal theology being preached from the Bible. And if that's going to cause you to grind your teeth every time you hear it, then you're probably not going to be at peace. If you're the kind of person that's going to write a letter to your pastor and disagree with him every single time he says something that you don't like, you're probably going to end up causing more problems for yourself and for him than you would if you were to be able to drive to a church that you could be totally at peace and comfortable with their theology. Not only that, but there are some of us, and I don't think favorably of this. I really do not think favorably of this. But there are some of us who have tried to be a part of a church that we disagree with, and what we do is we covertly try to work around the pastor and the elders. And I honestly don't think much of that. I think that lacks integrity. If you're going to go to a church, you should generally be in alignment with the mission and the vision of that church, but you probably shouldn't be working underground and against the grain to undermine the very work of your pastor. So if you're going to find yourself doing that, Daniel, then it's probably better that you would drive that hour to go to the church that you think you're going to agree with a little bit more. So let me put the question back to you and simply ask you, how are your peacemaking skills? How are you able to work with those who disagree with you? What level of exactitude are you going to need to have when it comes to the theological nuances of the differences between the 1689 and the 1647 Westminster Confession of Faith? If you're going to be, Daniel, the kind of letter writing, complaint letter, letter to the session, letter to the elder, squeaky wheel gets the grease person who is going to pet peeve your pastor to death, so that you actually distract him from his work of caring for the people of God with your highly nuanced questions that he can never quite answer to your own exactitude, to your satisfaction, then you should probably look elsewhere. You should probably make that drive and go to that place an hour away. However, and only you know yourself, because I don't know you, if you find yourself to be that kind of amicable person who can participate in a local, faithful, Bible-believing congregation, faithfully proclaiming the Word of God, although perhaps with some difference of detail in the way we formulate those highly nuanced distinctions in our theology, if you're the kind of person that is a peacemaker, that is amicable, where you feel like you could lead your new wife and whatever children God may give you, faithfully, both as the head of household and as a supportive member of the local church, then by all means, it seems like it would behoove you to stay as local as possible. After all, we really should think of our churches as our home away from home. The reason why the church is most beautiful when it's most local is because we presumably want to care for and impact for the good of the gospel the very community in which we are situated. And while certainly it's the truth that many of us have to drive for long distances to go to a church that's faithful, generally speaking, it's best for the impact of the church and the community in which it resides if its members are also caring for those same people. Now, given the fact that there are so few faithful churches these days, I really do think that it's better to be part of any church, any faithful Bible-believing church, than it would be to be doing your own thing as solo Christian out there. I really don't think that's a faithful expression of the body of Christ. So get involved in one of the two churches, and whichever one you choose as your conscience would dictate, then support it, love it, serve it. Be the kind of person that can love the members there, that can truly support your pastor, pray for him, support your elders in whatever way you can, worship Jesus, win the lost, care for the sick, witness to your community. All that is good and right and beautiful. Now, let me also say this, Daniel, because I picked this up just kind of reading between the lines in your email. And I mean this is no disparagement to your character. Trust me, this is not an insult. But you mentioned in your email that there were a number of changes that took place in your theology in the last couple of years. For instance, you mentioned a switch from premillennial dispensationalism to amillennialism. You mentioned a conversion into Reformed theology and then also into confessional theology as well. And from your email, it sounded as though all of that change happened very, very quickly. Now, we who've been Reformed for a little while, we listen for these things with an ear of experience, because there is such a thing as the cage stage Calvinist. If you're not familiar with that term, the cage stage is kind of that season of fast-paced maturity where you're growing theologically in your own faith. But what typically happens during that stage or period of great growth is that you look back and you can't believe that others haven't likewise made that same jump that you have. You are shocked at what you used to believe only 12 months ago, and you expect others to be able to change their own opinions, perhaps maturing into more mature views, but at the same pace that you are. And usually what happens with these cage stage type of Reformed Calvinistic Christians is that unfortunately they can be very mean, they can be very terse, they can be very abrupt and very sharp with the people who, quote, just don't get it, unquote. And unfortunately, it's at that very moment that they cease to be a compassionate and faithful witness, and they end up turning into, and I'm not saying you are, but many people end up being very pharisaical during those stages. So given the fact that you've moved from a position of generality to some very highly specified nuances of faith. I mean, think about what you said in your email. Amillennial, a federal 1689 subscribing Reformed Baptist. That's a pretty specific ask for any church. Okay, how many churches are there that fulfill all of those gradations? Well, very few. And so if you're expecting to be able to find a church that's going to meet you at every single one of those details, then you might want to set your bar of expectations fairly low, because it's going to be tough to find a church like that. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't try. And by all means, if you can find a church that suits you, then throw yourself into it, heart and soul and mind and strength. Personally, I think it would be best for you to attend that PCA church, give it a chance, give it a listen, be faithful, plug yourself into the local community. But again, it comes down to the whether or not you have those marginal tolerances built into your personality so that you are a real contributing member of the church rather than an anchor that your pastor and your session are going to constantly be dragging as they're trying to move forward with a vision of their own faith and ministry in their church. All right, so your second question had to do with resources, and I didn't write you back with any specific resources, but let me name a few of them right now. You specifically mentioned you're looking for some resources on Presbyterianism and the Confession of the Westminster in particular, so let me just throw up a few books for you in no certain order. They're just arranged on my desk here. Here's one called Seeking a Better Country by D.G. Hart and John Muther. This is a history of American Presbyterianism in the last 300 years. So if you want to understand a little bit about the history of the Presbyterian Church, that might be a good place to start. Since it sounds like you're pretty deep into theology, I would recommend that you get for yourself a good edition of the Westminster Confession of Faith. Let me show you the best one there is. There's this hardback one right here, which I really love. It's a sewn hardback edition with tons of the biblical references. If you're going to get any confession of faith, I would suggest this one. Speaking of the confession, if you're looking for a commentary on the Westminster Confession of Faith, then this one by A.A. Hodge is pretty dense and pretty specific, pretty refined, and very helpful in its formulations of Reformed confessionalism. This book right here is a paperback on being Presbyterian by Sean Michael Lucas. This is a great kind of an entry-level book on Presbyterianism. It's subtitled Our Beliefs, Practices, and Stories. And that's going to give you a little bit about some of the theological nuances of Presbyterianism, along with some background history and information about our coming to America and several of the denominations here, including and especially the PCA, which you are considering in your email. Two more here. This one is a commentary on the larger catechism, the Westminster Larger Catechism. The Larger Catechism is a very interesting part of the standards. You know, of course, we have three parts to the standards. There's the main confession, which is 33 chapters. There's the more famous shorter catechism of 107 questions and answers. Those are usually for children, for youth, and for newbies into the faith. And then the Larger Catechism is one of the tougher documents in the Reformed standards. And here's a great commentary by Johannes G. Voss. It's a very helpful, in-depth, detailed explanation of the Larger Catechism with a ton of scriptural references as well. Now, I hate to be a self-promoter, but here goes. Don't forget also that there's my book, the devotional commentary on the Westminster Confession of Faith called Hold Fast the Faith. This basically takes you through the 33 chapters of the main Westminster Confession in a devotional style. So you sound like you may be beyond what I did here in this book, but many people have found this to be very helpful, especially those who are just now dipping their toe into Presbyterian faith and theology. And so if you want to take a step up to something a little bit harder than a devotional, but maybe you're not quite ready for A.A. Hodge's serious explanation of the confession, then my book would be just a nice paced, pretty easy read as far as introducing yourself to the Westminster Confession of Faith goes. All right, so what I'll do for you, as always, is I will post a link in the description of this video to all of the resources that I mentioned heretofore. Brother Daniel, I know that's not your real name, but I do pray for you in your search to find a good local church. There are many people in the same boat who are trying to find a faithful congregation. Find one, join it, love it, serve it, and you'll be the better for it. Thank you so much for watching this video, everybody. Don't forget the links in the description. Do love you lots. Talk to you later.